Hello from Washington and welcome to the Hill Sunday. I'm Chris Steyerwalt. The narrow Republican majority has surprised everyone with what it's been able to get done so far. Now, Speaker Mike Johnson and Majority Leader John Thune have an ambitious goal: pass the much-anticipated budget blueprint before the Easter recess. Now, that leaves them just 12 days to build the vehicle that's supposed to move the president's agenda. Remember that one big, beautiful bill? Well, it has to link a tax overhaul with border, defense, and energy policy changes. They have an agreement in principle, but not an agreement on the principles. Where will the spending cuts come from? And how deep? Can leadership placate swing state Republicans and hardliners? And we haven't even started to talk about taxes. How many of the president's campaign promises, like no taxes on tips or Social Security, can Republicans add before they start raising taxes elsewhere? Wow. With us now is Republican Congressman Jody Arrington of Texas, and he happens to be the chairman of the House Budget Committee, so he's got his work cut out for him. And he put together round one, and now he's waiting for the return volley from the Senate. Mr. Chairman, thanks for making time for us. Over in the Senate, the fiscal hawks say not enough cuts. You're not cutting deeply enough, but moderates are concerned about potential changes to Medicaid, among other things. We've talked to members from both of those camps here, and they've said that they voted for the version in the House because they were promised it would come back from the Senate moving in their direction. They cannot both be right, can they?
No, you have to strike a balance so that everybody has to grab a hold of the rope and pull our country back from the precipice of a debt crisis and to restore fiscal health, which means we have to incent investment and growth. That's where the tax cuts come in, reining in regulation, opening up domestic energy production. But we have to bend the curve on mandatory spending. That's 75% of the entire federal budget. It's 90% of the growth in spending. That spending has to come down. We have a bunch of waste and woke and bloat, and we've got to start pulling that down so that we can have better and brighter days ahead of us, both economically, from a security perspective, and for our children's future and global leadership. That's what's at stake, and we did that in a balanced way in our resolution, offsetting the cost of tax cuts by reducing spending at almost $2 trillion and bringing that debt to GDP down. That's what the Senate ought to do. We've cut the path for them. They should follow suit.
Okay, a new report says that folks at the White House are discussing letting tax rates go up on top earners in order to finance some tax cuts for the working class. Now, that would be in keeping with your party's sort of populist vibes these days. What do you say about that idea, about letting some of the top rates go up to finance cuts for working class Americans?
Well, I would say that the top 10% of earners in this country already pick up 70% of the freight in terms of the cost of our federal government. I would also say that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that we're talking about extending or making permanent actually increased the share of taxes paid by the top 1%. It's the people on the lower income spectrum. It is the families in the middle that saw the highest gains. In fact, they saw 2 times the gains in wages, 3 times the gains in wealth, and we lifted 6 million people out of poverty. So I would just suggest that we ought to lower the tax burden for everybody. All boats rise on the tide of prosperity, and we had record investment, record R&D, and we had record job growth as a result. And we've got to get off of economic high center, avoid a recession, bring down the cost of living. So the tax cuts are a cornerstone of the economic agenda. And if we don't act, Chris, we're going to have a 22% tax hike on every American. That's not sustainable now or at any time. And so we've got to be responsible to extend these, but offset them with reduction in spending so that we don't shift the tax burden to our children, because that's what the deficit and debt is, a deferred tax on our children.
Okay, so on those tax cuts, the 2017 tax cuts that are set to expire this year, They were designed in a way in order to hold down the cost over the long term, meet the requirements of budget reconciliation, and get deficit hawks on board. They were set to expire. They were built to expire. Now there are a bunch of Republicans who want to extend those cuts, but not pay for them. And they're calling it current policy baseline. So basically, forget about the score. That's baked in the cake. You've raised some concerns about how what looks like maybe to somebody outside Congress an accounting gimmick, that this could threaten the reconciliation procedure and it could drive up deficits. Talk about what you see there.
Well, let me first say in the positive, if we extend these tax provisions for 10 years and we pay for them, we offset the impact to the deficit, I'm open to giving comparable treatment to spending programs by saying we're going to assume that these are permanent. But what you can't do, Chris, is assume that there's no impact to tax cuts on the budget or the deficit. And so if the Senate is simply using current policy to get tax cuts permanent while avoiding or skirting the responsibility to bring down spending commensurately, then that's a non-starter. That's an absolute non-starter, because what you're going to do is you're going to increase a annual deficit that's already $2 trillion and will double in 10 years. With the current policies today, you would add trillions of dollars to the deficit, and that's not just bad economics. It's immoral to do for our children. So you have to have a balanced budget resolution approach like we did in the House. No games, no gimmicks. Let's do solid economic policy, good fiscal policy, and ensure our country and our children's future is solid, and our better days, like I said, are ahead of us.
Okay, let's turn to Social Security. You've talked for as long as you've been in Congress, certainly about the need for structural changes to keep that program solvent, Medicare too. Now, the promise from DOJ is that entitlement programs can be saved by just eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse. But that premise has already run into problems as moves to close Social Security offices and require beneficiaries to report in person to verify their identities has led to bipartisan outrage and a swift retreat in many places. But an office in your district, the one in Abilene, was not spared. How are your constituents responding to that?
I think my constituents are going to love the fact that this was an unutilized space that we're getting rid of so that we can actually make Social Security a sustainable program for those who need it. It's a critical program for the millions of seniors who depend on it. And every time we spend a dime or dollar wastefully or fraudulently, we cut into that program. We accelerate on the Social Security side, we accelerate the insolvency, which is already due in 8 years, which would be an automatic 20% cut across the board. We should start the reform of these programs with cleaning up the waste, fraud, and abuse. On Medicare, there's upwards of $500 billion over the 10-year window in improper payments. There's also inefficiently run parts of that program. For example, we pay more to hospitals for the same outpatient procedures as physicians and physician groups, costing more for our seniors, costing more for the system. If you just equalize those payments, you'd save close to $150 billion. So a lot of work has to be done to clean up these programs, make them run well, cut out the fraud, and then we have to work on in a bipartisan way in the long run. There's no other way to do it. Democrats and Republicans have to come together, and they have to work to make sure that these programs are sustainable into the future, and it's going to require political will from both sides to put down the baseball bats that they used to beat on each other, one for raising taxes, one for cutting the benefits of these programs, and we have to be adults, and we have to put our seniors and our country first. That's why, as budget chairman, I passed a bipartisan fiscal commission that got Democrat support, Republican support. That's the way we have to approach this. We'll do right to our seniors, and we'll do right to our country and our children, because these two programs, by the way, make up about 95% of the $125 trillion in unfunded liabilities 30 years out. That's on top of the 36 trillion we're already in debt.
Before I lose you, I got to ask. Speaking of bipartisanship, on Thursday, Republican Susan Collins and Democrat Patty Murray, the top members of the Senate Appropriations Committee, sent a letter to the White House accusing them of violating the law by not spending money as Congress had directed it, saying, quote, just as the president does not have a line item veto, he does not have the ability to pick and choose which emergency spending to designate it. It is incumbent on all of us to follow the laws. We're written not as we would like it to be. We are talking about the I word here, Mr. Chairman, impoundment. What do you say to those senators? Can the president pick and choose?
Well, I wish Congress had the courage that our president has and his colleagues, especially Elon Musk, because they take a lot of flack to do the things that we ought to be doing in our oversight capacity. That's a constitutional responsibility that we have shirked for so long, which is why the waste keeps ticking up. But look, I'm an Article 1 guy. I'm a constitutionalist. And the president has the right to push pause where there's waste and fraud. He has the right to stop spending that's wasteful. But at the end of the day, my belief is these are going to have to come back in either rescissions packages or in the annual appropriations process. I have a lot more confidence in the president and Elon Musk in doing the right thing, but ultimately that decision for cutting waste in those packages will have to be squarely on the shoulders of Congress, which probably doesn't imbue a lot of confidence to the American people, but I believe that's the reality.
Okay, if you were from Muleshoe, you would know him already, but if you don't, there he is, Chairman Jody Arrington. We thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chris.
You bet.
God bless.
God bless you.